Welcome back to the Context Coaching Podcast. We continue our series of Australian coaches as we meet with James Jansen this week, the associate head coach at Davidson University. Coach, thanks for being here today. Appreciate
College.
you taking the time.
Davidson College.
Davidson College, that's right, my
Yeah,
fault. Should
yeah.
know that with Steph Curry being a Californian these days, but awesome to have you on. Thanks for being here. Looking forward to our chat.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, let's dive in. Take us through your background. And this is usually where we ground the audience and who we're talking with. So take as long as you want. Tell us the whole story from coaching 13-year-old or 10-year-olds at age 13 until now as the associate head coach there at Davidson.
Yeah, I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and grew up in the outer eastern suburbs and Melbourne. I know you've spoken to two Melbourne coaches recently, but Melbourne's definitely the hub of basketball in Australia. And through the early 90s, when I was growing up, it was a basketball boom. We had the likes of Andrew Gaze and a bunch of people that have now led to having kids that are in the NBA and doing cool things within our national league at that point in time. And so I grew up in the basketball space and playing as a young player, and then got involved in the kind of representative basketball pathway a little bit later than most people in Australia. I kind of juggled multiple sports, played some Australian rules football, played some tennis, played some other things. And then at about age 16 is when I dove a little bit more into the true representative pathway. And at that point in time, I started playing for a club called the Blackburn Vikings. And ironically, actually joined at the same time I joined that program in the junior component. I actually was selected onto their senior team at the same time with my first kind of iteration into that representative basketball space in Victoria. So from that point in time, I played 10 years for Blackburn on the senior side, played youth basketball, and then got heavily involved in that coaching space from quite a young age and had an interest in doing so. I had a couple of younger brothers. I coached their teams. I think when I was about 13, I coached my brother's kind of 10 and under team. And then that really picked up when I finished my junior basketball career, which is the best way to think of it is at under 18 level. Once you graduate out of that, you move a little bit more into what we call senior basketball in Australia. And so once I moved into that kind of post 18, I coached kind of boys and girls throughout that stretch. I think my first group I ever coached was an under 18 boys team that next year. It was not the top team in our club at that point. And then I quickly transitioned to being our kind of under 18 girls coach at the club. So coached that for a little bit, flip-flop back and forth between boys and girls, coached some under 14 age group, some under 18 age group mostly during my time there. At the same time I was playing, also the same time I was working in an administrative role within our club, which is how that works. Now, all that was going on while I was pursuing my university studies. So I pursued a degree in exercise science at Deakin University. And then while I was doing that, at the conclusion of that, I ended up working at the university for about 4 years in teaching and research capacities. And so was tying some of that stuff together within our club setting from the strength and conditioning component through the kind of athletic development component. And then also just in reference to with doing so much teaching at the time, bringing that teaching background into the coaching that I was doing as well. And that obviously sounded like a lot to be doing all at once, and it was. And I had a really good mentor at Deakin at that point in time who was really mindful about all the different hats that I was trying to wear at once. And so we tried to devise a little bit of a plan on a way that I could find a way to streamline some of what I was doing and make a career out of something in a more meaningful way. And that led me to, in 2012, to accept a position into a graduate program at Wake Forest University in the United States, where I was then choosing to pass up the kind of playing background that I was doing and then dive a little bit more into my studies and coaching. And then, so I spent 5 years working with the women's basketball team at Wake Forest. I finished my master's degree, ended up working in kind of research at universities, and then actually partly pursuing my PhD, which I then stopped to take this position that I'm currently in at Davidson now. And yeah, wrapping up, we're entering our ninth season here at Davidson and moved from being an assistant coach when I first got here to now being the associate head coach. And yeah, really enjoyed the experience of doing coaching full time.
Can you share a little bit? And I know we've talked about this on the last few episodes I've had with my Aussie friends, but how it's semi-normal for younger people to dip their toe in the water into coaching relative than here, where it's more rare to get kids that are fresh out of high school or even in high school coaching those younger leagues. Why do you think that's the case? And where have you seen that or not seen that or seen pathways for people to get involved before maybe they think they're ready?
Yeah, I think what's really nice about it is, and I attribute this to probably the coaching skill of most of the people that I'm friends with back in Australia that have done this coaching for a long time. Even when I moved into this space, the amount of coaching reps and things that I'd had at age 26 far exceeded anyone else that I was working with at that point in time, even those that were 35 or older. And I think what it stems down to in the Australian context is that you have this integrated infrastructure for the youth sport, partly because it is a club-based system. And so you're part of that same program, right? So maybe you're playing on the U16 team at a club, and there's a U9 or U10 entry level team at that club, and maybe you're involved in starting to mentor those kids and coaching them. And you might have some parent supervision while that's going on. There might be a parent assistant or something that's helping out with it, but being able to generate that excitement at that point. And then obviously there's version as you move further on that the representative stuff happens and becomes a little bit higher level, that just because of the integrated nature of these clubs, it's just a very natural kind of transition within that space. And I think the club piece is a really big part of that. I think things being at the same venue, if you're at in an Australian venue on a Saturday in the domestic leagues, which is the kind of recreational league style, you're going to show up in the morning and there's going to be under 8 games, and then the next time slot's going to be the under 10 games and under 12 games and so on. And even in the representative element, same thing. You're going to have 640 games are probably going to be the under 12s. You go 740, the under 14s, under 16s at 840, under 18s at 940. And so I think just that integrated nature of how that works with these kind of league structures helps that we've got big cities in Australia, right? Like you were dealing with large metropolitan areas of a Melbourne or a Sydney that maybe we don't have so much or so many similarities, particularly here on the East Coast, where things maybe in North Carolina, there might be 7 or 8 different large regional areas that people could be from. And then I think it's the influence of travel sports, right, in the United States, where everyone's going to other places to go play. They're traveling to another town. And so it's way more difficult for maybe a young person to be involved with that while also simultaneously pursuing their playing career as well.
I'm sure you haven't listened to a ton of these, but my soapbox is how much I despise club athletics in the States and travel sports and how they are destroying what was once a pure system. Do you see a pathway at all for the system that exists in Australia where it's very controlled, it's very much, I'm not going to say regulated, but there's definitely infrastructure around what's supposed to happen and what does. Is there any pathway to blend some sort of that with the Wild West that exists here, or is that genie so far out of the bottle, we're done with it?
I think it has a lot to do with what the funding mechanisms are and the nature of the United States. Its capitalist nature and everything is there's clearly not money coming from the government to structure any of these things. And it's not usually in single individuals' best interests to be able to structure something like this, or those that want to try to do something like that are fighting against the grain in a really big way. And so I think the only way that it would be able to operate in a more meaningful way is if the national governing bodies or the professional organizations step in and have a slightly bigger role to play in the youth sport development. I think where it's really kind of showing up in that space right now is probably with the NFL's activity in the flag football space. And they've had a bit more of a top-down approach, and there's probably been a little bit more organization to it. Obviously, they got it as an Olympic sport in 2028 as well. But I think you see that as an example or as a bit of a template where maybe some of this is possible if an organization such as that step in. And in the basketball space, that would have to be something like the NBA or USA Basketball to do something like that. But it's got to be really integrated. And I think you look around the country and like people can't even agree on the same playing rules for high school basketball in the United States. So I think to then think about a way to integrate an entire system is a pretty tall proposition at this point in time.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. And I think it speaks to, I mean, beyond sports, right? The climate that currently exists nationwide in regards to the us against them and the state versus the federal government, and ultimately it trickles down to sports as well. What would you say that is low-hanging fruit that if you're coaching a club team right now and you wanted to steal some of the best practices that work, you could recommend from your experience in the Australian system, right? Things you'd love to see that you don't think are that hard to add.
Yeah, like I think it's very feasible to have a vertical of where I think some people would consider them feeder programs or whatever, but some kind of integrated structure at which someone moves from an entry level of trying to play a sport to the point at which maybe they're transitioning to a high level club situation and then maybe college or maybe high school or whatever. And I think that balance is that there is a tension between those that try to do that well and the high school space as well, being able to own their space in all of that, which I think is a really tricky component. I know we deal with that a little bit in the women's basketball space of kind of June being maybe a month a little bit more for the high schools to have high school team camps and different things. But I think that part's tricky. But really, I think thinking about the way that people can enter the space of playing the sport and how they then move through that structure, I think that's the lowest hanging fruit of being like, hey, at least we've thought about this, right? We have an opportunity. I think this country lacks the playing sport for sport's sake component as well, right? That in Australia, there's just adults playing in random leagues, and there's pathways for people to do that. Like it's totally okay for a 14-year-old kid to play with their friends on a domestic basketball club in Australia, where I don't think that really happens here. There's always a selection for something. You're making a middle school team. You're doing travel this, like you're a 10-year-old doing travel baseball. And so I think there's that opportunity to build a true infrastructure that looks like that. Now, whether that has other associated entities with it as well that then provide this big overarching infrastructure that we have in Australia or have in other countries, I think that's the question mark. But I do think you could have a vertical of someone entering a sporting space and taking them through to a point at which they're no longer involved in the sport.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word pathway a couple times, and that's something that is very prevalent down in Australia. You go to the facility in Melbourne there where the NBL team played, and it's on the wall. What exactly does that mean? So for youth coaches, for high school coaches, for middle school coaches in the States, to take that word pathway and break it down, what does that actually mean in regards to how you're scaffolding your structure and your growth and your infrastructure and your skill sets?
Yeah, I think the pathway idea refers to someone working their way through a system to fully achieve their goals, right? And based on those goals and based on the aptitude of an individual and their physical maturation and mental maturation, there's going to be different requirements from that, right? There's going to be different needs. And I think here the difference is that everyone is on their own individual pathway that isn't part of an integrated structure. And so everyone thinks, okay, hey, I've started playing basketball at age 7, whatever. I'm going to be playing part of this little rec league that's in my neighborhood. Now I'm going to move to be part of the travel program. Maybe that's a local travel program that plays only teams in the Charlotte area or whatever. Maybe we play one tournament a year in Myrtle Beach. And now I move through that pathway in theory to be on maybe you're at a point where you're on a shoe circuit team in the AAU basketball, or maybe you're matriculating from being on a JV team to a varsity team, or moving from middle school to a high school basketball program. I think everyone is part of a pathway. They just don't know it, or it's just not intentional. And that pathway, whether rightly or wrongly in the States, is seen as having college as the pinnacle, right? And so everything is geared towards that. I think that's one of the issues with this setup is that there's too many eyes on this fake end goal. Whereas I think probably within an Australian context, there's a little bit more intentionality that it's okay for everyone to be at every step of the pathway, and that's okay. And yeah, there's the goal for people to be future national team players, future opals and boomers, and work people through that pathway, but it's not the goal of everyone when they enter the pathway to be there.
Yeah, no, you mentioned it earlier where there's adults still playing, and I think the sport for the sake of sport comment really lands if you've been there and you've seen what that looks like. Where my cousins were 50 years old and she was going off to play a field hockey game. like while I was there 2 years ago. And I'm like, wait, what? No, like the adult leagues around here are definitely not that.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that exists. And I'm curious why you think that doesn't exist here for us.
I think it's interesting. I think the sport that does it best in the US is tennis, right? And so you've got, and we talked about the version of having an overarching organization that makes that happen. That's the USTA, right? So the USTA, it's pretty organized. They run their leagues. There's a structure at which that happens. They've monopolized the sport of tennis within the country. It's worked with, obviously, pickleball's come in to try to take that away from them. But I think there's plenty of examples where that tennis version works. But I think the reason it doesn't exist here is there's not really this overarching body that kind of oversees things. And even from an Australian standpoint, like all of those leagues often are part of an association that has a bigger purpose. That bigger purpose then has insurance components with the national governing body. And there's all these things that tie together, right? That mean these aren't individual operators trying to run this stuff. And so I think that's a really big part of it. You also have once again, the metropolitan area of those cities do make things a little bit easier. But yeah, it's just, I think college beats out. It's not like it when people go to college, they're not playing intramurals and those kind of things. It's just that phase afterwards, because people are often moving away from their current setup, there's a gap, right? There's a gap between when they've maybe been involved in their kind of local area sports from age 5 through 18 to when they maybe resume that as an adult. That most of these people in Australia aren't moving out of Melbourne, aren't moving out of Sydney. They're there. And so there's just a continuity that I think breeds things being helpful.
Yeah, that's actually the first time I've heard that, and it makes total sense because you have these handful of big metro areas, and then it's just not even suburbia, right? Just rural. And yeah, and so where here, right, everything is just suburban sprawl, and your neighborhood is your neighborhood. So interesting take. I like that. All right, let's go. Actually, let's talk a little bit about basketball. So you mentioned earlier that you played AFL, you played tennis, you did these other things, and then you landed on basketball. Give me your take on the importance of diversity in your sports sampling and at what age you would actually promote specialization. And I'm asking because the youth sports industrial complex, in my opinion, has ruined the childhood of kids because they're just promoting specialization so young. And what I have seen in the kids we've matriculated to college athletics is 90% of our kids that are going on to play college athletics in any sport are multi-sport athletes. Yet that's not what's being pitched by your local club. Can you talk a little bit about your own philosophy on that and what you've seen for the last 9 years at the collegiate level and who's landing in that space and what's best to help prepare to get there if that's really what you're chasing?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question, right? And it's on my mind a lot. Like I have a lot of the mentor I mentioned before. I've tried to coach him through. His kids now are matriculating out of kind of youth sports. And I've got a 6-year-old daughter right now who we're at the start of trying to think about how to best kind of set her up just for the enjoyment of sports. And I think every sporting context is a little bit different. And I do think that some of it has to be driven by the kid and not by what other people think something should look like. So we come across a lot of players at this level that are really good players that have specialized in the sport since the age of 10. And then there's probably an equal amount of players that maybe play through high school, right? Maybe play a volleyball and a basketball through high school, or maybe play soccer through to 15 years old, or do those kind of things. And I think having the ability to have some other tasks that provide some variability physically to the individual is a really important thing. We're obviously seeing that in the NBA and the WNBA right now with really high injury rates with certain injuries that could maybe be attributed to a lack of variability that these players have had through their kind of developmental years. So I do think it really depends on the individual. Now, in an ideal world, the club system probably doesn't exist quite like it does right now or has the same demands as it does right now that would allow people to maybe explore some different things. But I would say any kid before the age of 14 should be trying to do multiple things. And then depending on a kid's goal, I think being able to do multiple sports through the first couple of years of high school is important. Understanding what someone's goals may be. Like if they're starting to get to the pointy end of being a recruitable college athlete and their livelihood is going to rely on that scholarship and whatever, and they're only good in that one sport. At that point, you got to think about trade-offs, right? If I hurt my ACL in a soccer game and I'm a high-end college basketball player and that scholarship may not exist until I get there, then I think at that point in time, you have to start thinking about things. I do think, and maybe this is a controversial take, but I do find it funny in the US that people refer to multi-sport athletes when someone is a football player and a track and field athlete. I just don't see those being two sports. That's not the same thing. So I'm not like, to me, track and field, like I'm not willing to count track and field as one of your sports if you like for you to call yourself a dual sport athlete.
I love
Now,
that
my
take.
wife was a cross country runner. That's awesome. Great. She ran cross country in college, but like that's not a sport. You're just doing running.
Well, and okay, so let's dive into that. And I want to explore this further because I don't disagree.
Yeah.
But what I will say is at least that kid, for all intents and purposes, is representing their school in two different
Totally.
seasons. They're out there promoting the brand more than
Totally.
once. And I think that to me is where we've lost something in athletics, which is you're trying to learn how to be part of something bigger than yourself. And maybe track isn't your favorite, but the school needs you, right?
Yeah.
And there's no downside to doing it. So why not? And you mentioned if you're only good at one sport, maybe that's what you need to settle in. It's okay, cool. But what if you're really good at multiple and the pressure's coming from the outside to pick? So you take like Kiki Rice, who's National Player of the Year in basketball and soccer. And now all of a sudden, if there's pressure because her aspirations are to be in the NBA or to be on the US national team for soccer, you got to pick. So, like, how do you look at that as your paradigm and say, this is one of the top players in the NCAA? And look, now, is she an alien and like just special that she could do that? Or is that really where if more people stuck with that, then they raise their ceiling in both endeavors? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think like in pot, she's an alien, right? I think that and her ability to play both of those sports are related to her physical aptitudes, right? Her ability to move in space and all those things, like those interact. And I think that's what I was getting at with the track and field piece is great, you're fast, that's awesome, you can run, you can jump, cool, that's great. But I think if you're trying to have these sports that feed into each other, that maybe the things you're doing on the soccer field or the things you're doing on the tennis court are able to almost compound on top of the skills in your primary sport. I think that's where you have to think a little differently about it, right? But I think every situation is a little different. Every context is a little different. I'm a big advocate for players setting guardrails in their development over what they are and willing and not willing to do, and being their own situation. And that's tough for high schools and club coaches to rationalize with. But you've got to monitor your own load. You've got to be the person that gives yourself seasonality where there's not seasonality built into your structure. So I'm a really big advocate of kids and parents taking an active role in that and saying, hey, like we draw the line at this, or hey, we're wanting to do that sport, but like we can't commit to 5 practices. Like we're only able to do 3 practices because she's able to balance both. And I think if we want more players to be able to do that, we do have to reduce that territorial nature of what's involved with some of these things for those multiple sport athletes to be able to do both if we think that's valuable.
Yeah, no doubt. And I just, again, it's my soapbox as a high school athletic director at a small school. I cannot afford not to have these kids play. And so I'm
Yeah.
always trying to pick the brains of people that are at this level that these kids are aspirationally chasing and trying to get that feedback loop so that they have it, right? And it's not that I'm right and they're wrong. It's just, look, here's perspective. And so take it for what it is and do what you want. It's more data. And then to your point, sit with your parents and yourself and put guardrails on your own experience. Let's go back to the coaching piece now. So you were a head coach in every facet of your life until you became NCAA college assistant. Talk about that transition. What did you realize? Almost moving backwards, right? Usually the proverbial move 18 inches over to be the head coach, and you're moving back the other direction and then sliding back up into the associate role. Like, what did you learn when you went back to being an assistant coach that you needed to figure out, that you realized you could bring with you, that you would offer others that are transitioning in either direction?
Yeah, I think what's really unique is I think the importance of having versions of head coaching experience early is really helpful. And I think that's why I really like that club structure in Australia that from the first time you get to coach, maybe you're able to try things, right? You're able to make mistakes, you're able to learn from experiences, you're able to figure things out and not be like, oh, I'm trying to dance around, get my head coach to do this and whatever. And you never get to try something when you're excited by it. And so I think that's something that was really cool for that first 12 years or so of coaching, of being able to kind of work through, figure out my own problems, figure out how I want to coach, what I liked about things, be able to put some of my learnings from both kind of the activity of teaching, but also from my studies into practice, being able to be a lifelong learner with that. I think that's really hard in some ways if you're only ever an assistant coach to be able to get those experience. There's no replacement from those reps of doing it. I think from the standpoint of making that transition, I think I was able to really relate with what, and obviously in quite a different context in the college setting to maybe the youth basketball space, but was able to relate with some of the decisions that were having to be made, or at least constantly thinking big picture. I think that's the problem that some assistants can fall into in the college space, particularly when they're going through this pathway of coaching that we have within college sports, where often maybe they've been a player, maybe they move into a graduate assistant spot, maybe they move into an administrative role, right, as a director of basketball operations or something like that, eventually get some experience as an assistant, is they never get the full picture, right? At no point do they get experience of having to zoom out and think that way. And so I think my lens just from that training is always constantly thinking about that big picture and how things pull together. I was very fortunate about this space, and it was quite intentional of making this choice to come to Davidson with Coach Gale when I did. But we were able to co-create some of this stuff together, right? This was her first college head coaching opportunity. She also came into college coaching from a similar style background where her dad was an AAU coach. And so while she was in high school or in college, she was coaching AAU teams as well, right? She was getting those reps as her own head coach. So I think we could kind of see that in each other. But yeah, I think that's a really big thing is as an assistant, being able to really zoom out, try to see big picture, not just your responsibility. Maybe you got a position group or a phase of the ball or whatever, and just, hey, try to understand all that's involved.
And how would you say that intertwines if you are leading a specific discipline program like basketball within the greater infrastructure of the university? One of the things that I run into is trying to help my head coaches see the big picture, right? Where they're advocating for their sport, and I celebrate that, but then there's constant overstepping in regards to, hey man, look, you need to zoom out here and you need to understand that there's 24 different programs besides yours. How would you say that lens has allowed you to both appreciate and understand what, say, the football team does? I don't even know if you guys have football or tennis relative to you guys, and creating that balance and harmony so that the university itself is uplifted?
Yeah, that's a tough thing. And that's a really tricky component. I do think it's a little different probably at the high school level than at the college level. And we're in a fortunate spot here. We are a basketball school, right? You mentioned Steph Curry at the very start, and we have a football team here, but they're part of a non-scholarship football league, which is a really unique setup. Yes, we are in a situation where kind of men's and women's basketball are kind of king and queen on campus. But I think where that really applies is like we have a pretty intimate understanding that, hey, as basketball programs, not as individual women's and men's programs, but as a basketball program, we're trying to drive a lot of this forward. So we have a really good relationship with our men's coaches here, and some of it is because they've had great continuity. We've had great continuity that we're dealing with the same people, but I think that part of like, all right, how do we make this a win for everybody, right? Like, how do we get this to be a point? And ultimately, you're in a spot where there are going to be a constraint on resources, right? There is going to be some level, whether that's support staff, whether that's understanding what's going on with the athletic trainers or communication staff or all those kind of things. You do have to understand they have other jobs to do as part of that and overstep with it. But I do think that whole area is going to be something that's ultimately challenged even further in the new era of college athletics, where you've got this revenue sharing piece, and now it's actually a zero-sum game between people where hey, if women's basketball gets this, the other team isn't getting that money because there's a cap on things. I think that's going to create a really unique dynamic. We won't have that here because of us not having scholarship football. We can keep growing the pie until to a point where we're never actually going to get to that point. But for a school like a North Carolina or UCLA or a Texas, like you're going to have these internal dynamics that are really toxic because it is a zero-sum game in those sense.
How would you say, to the extent that you can describe this, and you've been at multiple places where you and a men's program coexist in a way that is a win-win, right? Sometimes there's this competitive, it might be stated, it might be hidden, where it's us against them, right? Versus, yo, we want everybody to be successful. Talk about your experience there and what you've learned being in a space where it seems to be pretty symbiotic that you could offer others in relation to how do you keep the main thing here while taking care of your own program?
Yeah, I think we're pretty fortunate here from a facility standpoint that we have our own practice gyms. And so I think that's usually in kind of most places I hear about, and probably I'm sure at the high school level, the idea of this conflict over who's got practice times, how that works is often something that pops up a lot. That's the first point of conflict between those teams that's hard to get past. So we don't have that here that's helpful. But I think when you think about most versions of being able to grow things. And it's, hey, you get a fan to a men's basketball game. It doesn't mean that there's not a fan at a women's basketball game. It means we have one new basketball fan that's potentially going to come to both games, right? That's able to do that. We engage with the community or engage with the business in a certain way. That's a department thing, right? That's helping athletic department. We get a resource involved, and maybe that's hey, we got a sports psychologist here and they're working with things and we're able to get them on board and them showing interest. Well, hey, that's something that can benefit both teams, right? And there's going to be certain things where, of course, by the nature of how it's all going to work, that they're going to want something different than what we're going to want, right? And I think at that point, it's just that's okay, right? Because we value something a little different than what they value in that space. And I think that's a big part of it. But basketball, at least the basketball community, is a small enough community that a lot of people know a lot of different people. They've worked with different people, and maybe a recruit that we've got here has some connection to a recruit that the guys are want after, right? And so I think it would be foolish not to be aligned in some kind of way with a lot of those things. And once again, it doesn't mean we have to do every event together, have to hold each other's hands through what we do, but being able to communicate in a way like our men's basketball stuff. So Bob McKillop, the longtime men's coach here, retired, I guess, 3 years ago now, 4 years ago. His son is now the head coach. When his son became the head coach, he's like, hey, like that practice plan that you guys work off, like that template, I want it. I want to be able to utilize that. There's certain versions. I was recruiting a kid from another country. The men have had players from that country. It's like, all right, tell me about the experience of dealing with people from that area. What did they value? So I think it's just you've got to view that as a symbiotic thing. And I think once again, our success is not related to their success in any form, in any way. And so those are independent of each other, but at least trying to be team players where possible, I think is really important.
Yeah, 100%. And also from the standpoint of sharing, right? So if you guys do something really well, like I usually ask, what's the best thing you do in your program that you will take with you at all of your stops? And I'd love to hear that. But you also get the opportunity to look at a sustained successful program that McKillop ran at Davidson and be like, yo, we're stealing that. And I'm gonna come watch practice. So I'm curious, like, what is something that you think is the best thing you do that you would offer others? And what are some things that you've stolen both pre-retirement and post-retirement or shared based on the historical success both of your programs have had?
Yes, I think we were very intentional about trying to build this program, and a really big part of that was we saw the vision, like Bob, Coach McKillop, had laid out a vision of what this could look like here, right? He was here for 33 years, won countless conference titles, made the transition, played in the Elite Eight when Steph was here, made a transition to the Atlantic 10 Conference from the smallest Southern Conference, and won a lot. Won a lot at that level. Like immediately, they were really good. And a lot of it came down to probably two or really three different areas. And one of those was he was really flexible about the places that players were recruited from. He was one of the first ones to recruit internationally and in kind of the college basketball space. And for probably the best part of the 90s and early 2000s, if you went to Europe and said, hey, college basketball coach, Bob McKillop would be the first name that they would say in Europe. Now you get the Redeem team post that time, and Coach K obviously would probably have taken that role of being the most notable. But so I think that international recruiting piece was a really big thing. We saw, hey, there's a lot of reasons why that makes sense at Davidson that I won't dive into. I think the second part was having a system of play that was really conducive to what mid-majors could be good at, right? It was predicated on shooting. It was predicated on moving the ball. It was a motion offense, right? And a lot of teams are running his motion offense these days. Now, we were like, hey, maybe we don't want to run his motion offense, but let's find a different way of playing that is aligned with maybe what we think we could be good at, the type of players we could get, but have a system that we're kind of sticking to, not something where, hey, this year we've got these players, we're going to play this way. This year we got these players, we're going to play this different way. Let's have a system. And in college sports, you can do that, right? You're able to recruit, you're able to do those kind of things. So I think that's a really big part of the whole thing. And then I think third, it's just around the culture thing and being really intentional with details with people, right? And some of that's recruiting, some of that's bringing people into the right place. I think some of that organically happens at a place like Davidson, a small school where we're just attracting those types of people. But I think that it's funny, I was just heating up my lunch before I walked in here, and every time I walk to the same microwave, Bob used to put up that we share between our offices, Bob used to put up a sign saying sloppiness is a disease. And every time I clean my little thing that covers my stuff in the microwave, I remember that. But I think we are a program that's pretty detail oriented, but with freedom, right? He says with discipline comes freedom. And so we are a team that wants to play with a lot of freedom, wants to play that way, but we're going to be really disciplined in our structures on how we want to accomplish those things.
No, I love that. And before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about the, let's call it disparity between the top and bottom of the mid-major conferences and the Power Four these days, right? Where the top end of that is what it is, but the top end of the mid-majors basically slots in right below those guys. How have you seen that evolution happen for people that weren't part of our conversation? And where do you see it going with transfer portal, NIL, revenue sharing? Like, how is all of that impacting what your conference is now compared to, say, the ACC versus what it once was?
Yeah, I think it's been a really interesting 9 years here at Davidson in terms of the different phases we've gone through in college athletics during that realm. And we're a school where we don't have graduate programs, hence the Davidson College piece. We typically are graduating 4-year players that have often been here 4 years. And so we got this job in 2017. We go through a couple of years of doing it, and then COVID hits, right? And so COVID hits, that changes the dynamics of everything. You end up with, shortly after that, the transfer portal happening. As part of that, I think this is going to be the thing that will be interesting to watch in the college space in the next year or so, is now that these fifth-year COVID scenarios have gone away, what's going to happen with some of these programs and how they've built things, because now we're back a little bit more to what it was beforehand of not being able to top up with these kind of graduate students. And then you've got the revenue sharing era, NIL, all of that stuff we're in now. And so there's been a lot of different phases. And I think that where some of these kind of higher end mid majors have prospered during this stretch of the last kind of 7, or really the last 3 to 4 years, is it's those that have a really clear identity of who they think they are. And I think that was always the case, right? It was always a case that if you knew who you were, that you'd probably have a strategical advantage on other places. But I think now that there's even more shiny things in terms of the transfer portal, in terms of money flying about and whatnot, I think it's loaded even more heavily on people understanding who they are as coaches, as individuals, understanding who their players are, and understanding what they want their program to be. And I think you'll definitely see mercenary programs occasionally have success, but I think where you'll see people operating at the highest efficiency are the ones that have real clarity on what it is exactly that they're trying to be and relentlessly trying to stick to that.
Yeah, and do you think that in the situation where, and he used the word mercenary, and I know what that means, and hopefully other people do, but I don't feel that there's a pathway for everybody to compete. I feel that this situation has even furthered the divide, and that programs that are trying to compete with you, say, they're actually hurting themselves rather than figuring out, you know what, we can be the best C-level team in the nation, but we can't be an A-level team. What are your thoughts on that and where the pathways exist for certain schools, certain conferences to have even remotely a level playing field these days?
Yeah, it's some of this is a we'll see. And part of that is because what's going on with this kind of with the house settlement and the NIL situation is these programs are going to be capped. And so there's going to be lots and lots of situations with particularly these big football schools where their resources for men's and women's basketball are not going to be far outweighing what people at the mid-major level are able to do. And that's going to create a really interesting dynamic that we'll see if that's how it plays out, right? Current projections are that most of the Big East and a good chunk of the Atlantic 10 conferences and who are not football dominant conferences, don't most of those schools don't have football at all, are going to outspend these Power Four schools in basketball. That probably when we get to next year, when things are normalized, the likes of St. John's and UConn in men's basketball will probably be the highest paid men's basketball teams in the country, as opposed to how it had traditionally been. But I think the problem that some of these teams have in some of the bigger conferences towards the lower levels is they're almost suckered into acting in a certain way. Maybe contract status has to do with that a little bit as well. They're having to act a little bit more short term with their thinking. And often that just leads to kind of suboptimal strategies for both recruitment, retention, playing style, that I think a lot of these kind of high performing mid major programs that have great alignment with what they're trying to do, have great clarity on what they're trying to do, seeing better results from.
No, I agree with that. And I think it's as a guy that was in the space in the late 90s and as we weren't a major player, but it's every freshman redshirted. And then by the time they're seniors, you're playing 23-year-olds against 18-year-olds and you're being able to have success. And now the hurry up and wait doesn't exist anymore. It's the right now. And if I don't get it right now, I got other options. It sounds like some programs are still fortunate enough to have clarity and be able to recruit the type of kids that are willing to do that. It seems like you're rowing against the current in modern day sports. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting. Like the rowing against the current's an interesting one because I think the biggest challenge we're going to have in the next 2 to 3 years of this college space is what the goal had originally been. We talked earlier about the end of this pathway for a lot of Americans is this college scholarship. That experience is being completely redefined, right? What the college scholarship is, what it entails, the money that they can make in addition to that. And the question people are really being asked, and this is the reality, is like, how much money are you willing to take for your dreams to be bought out? That's actually what's going on. So it's, hey, like we used to be like, I'm picking this school because maybe in the future I want to be a businessman. I want to be a lawyer. I want to do this. Hey, my dream is to play. But hey, if the check's big enough, now we're in a scenario where, okay, maybe I take that bigger check and that part of my dream is out the window. And I think what we're in right now is we're in a little bit of level setting about some of this in terms of, I think a lot of these players are in a state of delusion in that they're being told these things, they're not listening, and then it's coming true, and then what then happens, right? So it's, oh yeah, like maybe my role will be smaller there, but like I bet you it's not, right? I think I can work my way to it not being that way. And so I think that's where some of this level setting, and so families that have great clarity about what they want, they're going to be the winners in this next phase of the next 2 to 3 years as we're figuring out what's real and what's not.
Yeah, no, that's great perspective, and I love that. There's some great things I'm gonna be able to steal there. All right, let's wrap up with this. I usually want to know from a growth mindset standpoint, how are you challenging your beliefs, right? So I usually ask, what is something you've recently changed your mind on, right? I used to be dug in over here, and now I've changed my mind and I'm over here. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Not necessarily just as a basketball coach, maybe it's as a parent, maybe it's as a colleague, whatever it happens to be, but you've intentionally gone against your previous belief system to challenge it.
Yeah, I think one thing that was interesting for me was the transition from being in an academic world, right, and being and even in the academic world, I was a version of a practitioner in that, right, within the exercise science piece. But I came from things from a very like empirical stat version of, hey, there's clear ways and the research says to do this, the research says to do that, and whatnot. And I think what I learned through that process is, and obviously there's a lot of different ways research can be done, and there's a lot of things that can't be researched, that we're never going to be able to know truly what the right answer is. And so I think understanding probably across the course of time, where there I was like, hey, like, what does the research say? To now be in a spot where it's, hey, let's integrate this knowledge. What does practice say? What do I think's best? What does my gut say in some of these things? And also just understanding what's unknowable, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of that. To me, that the skill development space right now is being a little over sorry, I'll say it a different way, over academically driven in a way that's just not real or not knowable. And I think that part's interesting, is how do you blend that into being a true practitioner? I think Mark actually spoke about it on his podcast the other week, of that art and science of coaching. And I think it's just probably the understanding over time of there being a little more art to this than science.
Yeah, and I think we can wrap with this, right? Where it's like there's an and, not an or. And so I was having this conversation last night just about the concept of plus minus in evaluating impact versus the eye test. And it's neither are perfect. But if you're picking only one, like, you're missing a whole bunch of stuff. So like, how do you blend all these different evaluative tools to land at a process for growth and development? And I think ultimately that's what we're striving to do to best serve our athletes and our programs, is making sure that we're taking the best of all these tools and blending them.
Yeah. Can I add something on that? Because it's a bit of a high horse of mine.
Yes.
Not so much the plus minus thing in particular, but I think one of the things that's really interesting in the athletic space, the sports space right now, obviously with analytics becoming more of a thing, more numbers, more data, is just, I'm coming from a spot, I've got lots of statistical background. I've worked in that space a lot, and a lot of people have really low levels of data literacy that are trying to do these things. And I think that's been really interesting, of being like, okay, like, what's the sample size? Like, even understanding what you're dealing with that. Hey, we're in the basketball space, understanding the difference between effective field goal percentage and regular field goal percentage. There's not that many people that actually understand that you bump into on the street, right? And so I think there's a lot of those things where I'd love to see data literacy improve as we try to communicate some of this stuff, but a lot of people are diving into some things that they don't really know much about.
Yeah, so we're going to extend this one more question since you brought that up, and I'm going to ask, what would you say are the metrics that are the lowest hanging fruit without needing a PhD to understand them, that your average coach at the high school level could implement, utilize, that automatically will uplift what their outcomes are?
So I think the biggest mistakes often made when looking at box scores, right? And this is one of my biggest things. Coach picks up the piece of paper and says, we're being out rebounded, right? We're being out rebounded. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Like, we looked at, like,
Yeah, how many shots have gone up, right? How many have we made? How many have we missed? What's your percentage?
So I think, so I think the biggest, lowest hanging fruit is looking at rebounding as a ratio of the amount of rebounds that could happen, right? So our offensive rebounding or our defensive rebounding rate was this. Best way to look at it is go offensive rebounds for the other team plus defensive rebounds from your team. Add those two together, that's the total rebounds. Now you're able to kind of look at that. So every time I get a box score, that's the first thing I look at. Hey, we've offensive rebounded 3 out of our 5 misses. Great. Okay, or 3 out of the 5 opportunities that there were. Hey, instead of losing our mind that something's gone up, we got 0 offensive rebounds. We can have 0 offensive rebounds if you shoot 70%. You're going to be in the spot. So I think that's the biggest mistake people often make, is getting lost in the sauce with some of that stuff. And I think the other lowest hanging fruit from just the pure standpoint of, if you're trying to create a game model and do the right thing, is just, have I taken more shots than the other team? Have I taken more shots than the other team? That's a great thing, right? That's offensive rebounds, that's turnover rate, that's all these advanced analytics kind of boiled into one thing. Have I taken more shots? Free throws come into it too. Maybe you divide your free throws in 2 to add on to it as well. Usually that's about what you've got. And now you identify, all right, did I have more possessions than them? Okay, that should be the goal. You move from there. I think in terms of low hanging fruit that anyone can do, I think that's usually the thing.
Yeah, no, those are great. And I think it's funny because many people look at it in that same way. And it's, hold on, there weren't that many rebounds. So like, why are you so mad about that? You made a bunch of shots. I love that. All right, coach, I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for giving us that, and looking forward to at some point when you're out on the West Coast coming to see you play.
Yeah, appreciate it. All right, thanks so much.
Yeah.